My name is Elena. I am 29 years old, and for the last 7 years of my life, I have operated as a senior forensic auditor for one of the top-tier firms in Chicago. My job is not merely to look at numbers, but to dissect them, to peel back the layers of offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent tax shelters until the ugly, jagged truth of a person's greed is laid bare for the IRS and the SEC to see. I am trained to spot a lie in a 3-cent discrepancy and to trace a trail of corruption through a labyrinth of encrypted digital ledgers. I have spent my career exposing the rot hidden behind the marble facades of shiny gold lifestyles, yet I somehow failed to see the decay in my own life until it was staring me in the face an hour before my wedding. I was standing in the bridal suite of the Grand Pierre Hotel, a venue that cost more for a single evening than my parents made in a year of honest, grueling labor. I was draped in a custom Vera Wang gown that felt like a shroud of heavy ivory silk, cinched at the waist so tightly I could barely draw a full breath. Outside those doors, 300 members of the city's elite were sipping Cristal and admiring the $10,000 floral installations. My parents, Maria and Thomas, were downstairs. They are good, quiet people from a small town in Ohio where my father spent 35 years at a steel mill and my mother worked as a seamstress. They had saved every penny for decades to contribute what they could to this day, even though my fiancé's family, the Sterling Vanes, treated their contribution like pocket change found in a sofa cushion. I had stepped out of the suite to find my maid of honor when I heard voices echoing from the secluded alcove near the service elevators. It was Alistair Sterling Vane, my future father-in-law, a man who built his reputation on old money and a pedigree that he claimed traced back to the Mayflower. His voice was like sandpaper on velvet, refined but abrasive. "Look at them, Julian," Alistair sneered, and I froze, my hand hovering over the heavy brass handle of the door. "Your bride's parents look like they wandered in from a bus station. They look too poor for this venue. They'll ruin the aesthetic of the room and the official photographs. Just put them by the service entrance where they belong. We can't have them in the front row where the governor might see them." I waited for the silence to be broken by a defense. I waited for Julian, the man I had lived with for 3 years, the man I thought I loved, to tell his father to rot in hell. Julian was 31, a partner at his father's investment firm, and he always smelled of Tom Ford Oud wood and arrogance. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend the people who had welcomed him into their modest home and fed him until he was full. Instead, I heard the soft, sickening click of a lighter, his signature St. DuPont gold-plated roller, followed by the scent of a Davidoff cigar. "You're right, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat and compliant. "I'll have the coordinator move their place cards to the back corner near the kitchen doors. It's better for everyone if they stay out of the way." In that moment, the ivory silk of my dress felt like it was made of lead. The betrayal was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating clarity that I usually reserved for high-stakes audits. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply turned around and walked back into the bridal suite. I sat down at the mahogany vanity, looking at my reflection in the gilded mirror, and I realized that for the last year, I had been auditing the wrong people. I had been so blinded by the idea of a family that I had ignored the red flags that had been waving in front of me since the engagement party at their estate in Lake Forest. The Sterling Vanes lived a life of extreme opulence, driving 2024 Bentley Bentegas and spending $40,000 on a weekend in Aspen. Yet I recalled several instances where Alistair seemed oddly frantic about the timing of certain wire transfers. As a forensic auditor, my mind began to race through the mental files I had subconsciously kept. I remembered the name of their primary holding company, Vane Heritage Holdings, and I remembered a conversation I'd overheard about a private equity deal that seemed too good to be true. I reached into my silk clutch, pulled out my encrypted work phone, and logged into the secure database I had access to. While the hair and makeup team buzzed around me, thinking I was just a nervous bride, I began a deep dive search into the public filings of the Sterling Vane empire. My fingers flew across the screen, navigating through layers of corporate shielding. 10 minutes in, I found it. A discrepancy in their 2022 tax filings, a massive charitable donation to a foundation that didn't exist in any federal registry. Then I found the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that were being used to pay off the interest on a series of predatory loans that kept their lifestyle afloat. The Sterling Vanes weren't wealthy. They were a house of cards held together by embezzlement and high-level fraud. They weren't old money. They were just old thieves. I stood up, the weight of the gown no longer bothering me because I knew I wouldn't be wearing it for much longer. I called my parents and told them to meet me in the private garden behind the hotel immediately. When I saw them, my father in his off-the-rack suit he'd worn to every funeral and wedding for 10 years, and my mother in her handmade lace dress, my heart broke for the way they had been dismissed. I told them to go to the valet, take their car, and check into a different hotel across town. I handed my father my credit card and told him to order the most expensive steak on the menu and wait for my call. They were confused, but they trusted me. Once they were safe, I walked back into the ballroom. The guests were all seated now, a sea of black ties and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon. I saw Alistair Sterling Vane standing near the altar, looking like a king in his custom tuxedo, and Julian beside him, checking his Patek Philippe Nautilus watch with an impatient expression. They thought they were about to marry into a clean reputation and use my professional standing to add a veneer of legitimacy to their failing firm. I didn't walk down the aisle. I walked to the front of the room from the side entrance, holding my laptop, which I had retrieved from my luggage. I signaled the technician at the sound booth, a young guy I had tipped heavily earlier in the day, and I handed him a thumb drive. "Play the file labeled The Truth," I whispered. Suddenly, the giant screens that were supposed to show a montage of our love story flickered to life. Instead of photos of us on the beach, the screens displayed a series of audited balance sheets, highlighted bank statements showing the illegal transfers, and a clear red-lettered breakdown of the $5 million Alistair had stolen from his own employees' pension fund to pay for this very wedding. The music stopped. The room went deathly silent, the only sound being the collective intake of breath from 300 people. I picked up the microphone from the lectern. "My name is Elena," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, steady and cold. "And as a senior forensic auditor, I've spent my life learning how to spot a fraud. I realized today that I was standing in a room full of them. Alistair, the service entrance is indeed where the trash belongs, but it's not my parents who will be using it." I looked Julian directly in the eyes. He was pale, his mouth hanging open as he watched his father's crimes being projected for the governor and the district attorney to see. "The wedding is canceled," I announced, "and the audit begins now." I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, the heavy silk of the dress rustling behind me like the sound of a closing ledger. I had spent years finding the rot in other people's lives, and today I had finally cleared it out of my own. I stripped off the gown in the locker room, changed into my jeans and a simple black sweater, and walked out the front door of the hotel. I didn't look back. I knew that by tomorrow morning, the Sterling Vane name would be synonymous with scandal, and their aesthetic would be replaced by the harsh fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom. Family isn't defined by the clothes they wear or the rows they sit in. Family is the blood and sweat of people like my parents, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever looked down on them again. As I hailed a taxi to meet my parents, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The numbers finally added up, and for the first time the balance was in my favor. Integrity is a currency that people like the Sterling Vanes will never understand, but it is the only one that truly matters when the lights go out and the truth comes to light. I had liquidated an empire in 60 minutes, and I had never felt more wealthy. My name is Elena, and if there is one thing a decade of forensic auditing has taught me, it is that the most expensive things in the world are often the ones bought with the cheapest souls. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal that occurred 60 minutes before I was supposed to say I do, you have to understand the hands that built the life I was nearly foolish enough to trade away. My father, Arthur, is 64 years old, and he has spent 38 of those years working as a night shift industrial janitor at a massive chemical processing plant on the industrial outskirts of Cleveland. His hands are a map of a lifetime of labor, permanently stained with the gray tint of industrial grease and the faint chemical scent of lemon-scented disinfectant that no amount of scrubbing can ever truly erase from his pores. He is a man of few words and immense dignity, the kind of man who believes that showing up is the highest form of love. Today, he arrived at the Starlight Plaza Hotel, a towering monument of glass and arrogance where the cheapest suite starts at $1,200 a night, wearing a charcoal suit he has owned since 2012. I watched him through the cracked door of the bridal suite earlier this morning as he spent 2 hours meticulously steaming that suit with a small plastic hand iron he brought from home. His tongue poked out in concentration as he tried to ensure that the man walking his only daughter down the aisle looked like he belonged in a room full of millionaires. Beside him stood my mother, Martha, a woman whose spine has been curved by decades of 12-hour shifts packing heavy crates in a cold storage warehouse where the temperature never rises above 34 degrees. Her fingers are perpetually stiff from the cold, and her face is etched with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who has never known a day of true rest. They didn't come to this wedding empty-handed or seeking a handout. Instead, they walked into my suite and handed me a physical cashier's check for exactly $18,500.00. I knew that number instantly. It wasn't just a wedding contribution. It was every single cent of their emergency fund, the money they had painstakingly scraped together over 40 years to ensure they wouldn't be a burden to me in their old age. They gave it all to me so that I could have what they called the wedding of my dreams at the Starlight Plaza, a venue where the floral arrangements alone cost more than the sedan my father has driven for the last 9 years. They stood there in their modest clothes, smelling of home and hard work, looking at the crystal chandeliers with a mix of awe and terror, terrified that they might accidentally break something they could never afford to replace. Meanwhile, less than 50 feet away in the groom's suite, a very different kind of reality was unfolding. My fiancé, Caleb, was lounging on a velvet sofa, surrounded by his father, Harrison Miller, and a group of groomsmen who all looked like they had been carbon copied from a country club brochure. Harrison Miller is a man who prides himself on his collection of vintage watches and his ability to make people feel small without ever raising his voice. I happened to be passing by the slightly ajar door of their suite, intending to give Caleb a quick, traditional, "don't see the bride" greeting through the wood, when the sound of Harrison's booming, arrogant laugh stopped me cold. They were drinking $3,500 bottles of Macallan 25-year-old Sherry Oak, pouring liquid that cost $350 a glass into crystal tumblers as if it were tap water. The air in that room was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the kind of casual cruelty that only exists among people who have never had to check their bank balance before buying a meal. I stood in the hallway, hidden by the shadow of a massive marble pillar, and listened as Harrison Miller mocked the very people who had sacrificed their entire future to fund the floral installations he was currently leaning against. I heard Harrison mimic my father's thick, working-class accent, laughing about how the janitor looked like he was wearing a sack of coal and wondering if they should provide my mother with an apron so she'd feel more at home near the catering staff. Caleb didn't stop him. Caleb, the man I had shared a bed with for 3 years, laughed along with them, his voice joining the chorus of ridicule. He joked about how my parents probably thought the appetizers were the main course and speculated on how long it would take for my father to try and clean up a spilled drink out of sheer habit. They were standing in a room decorated with $10,000 worth of white hydrangeas and orchids, flowers paid for by my mother's stiff joints and my father's night shifts, and they were using that beauty as a backdrop to strip my family of their humanity. As a senior forensic auditor, my brain is wired to look for the ask, the hidden motive behind every financial transaction. I suddenly realized why Harrison had been so insistent on this specific, over-the-top venue, and why Caleb had encouraged me to take my parents' money instead of letting the Millers pay for everything as they had originally promised. The Miller family empire, which looked so sturdy from the outside with its fleet of 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe high country SUVs and its sprawling estate in the suburbs, was a hollowed-out shell. I remembered the small details I had brushed off over the last few months, the way Harrison's credit card had been declined at a dinner in the city, the frantic calls he took in the middle of the night, the way Caleb had asked me to co-sign on a small investment just weeks prior. They were using my parents' life savings to maintain the illusion of their own wealth for one last night, hoping the prestige of this wedding would secure them a bridge loan from one of the elite guests in attendance. They weren't just insulting my parents, they were stealing from them in the most calculated way possible. I looked down at the cashier's check in my hand, the paper feeling heavy and hot against my skin. $18,500. To the Millers, it was the price of a few watches or a weekend in Vegas. To Arthur and Martha, it was 38 years of breathing in chemical fumes and shivering in a cold storage warehouse. It was every Saturday my father worked overtime instead of going to the park, and every pair of shoes my mother didn't buy for herself so I could have dance lessons. The sheer, staggering weight of their love was being treated like a punchline by a man who had never earned a single dollar without stepping on someone else's neck. My name is Elena, and I realized in that hallway that I had spent my entire professional life auditing strangers for corporate fraud, while the biggest embezzlement of all was happening in my own heart. I had allowed myself to believe that Caleb was different from his father, that his love for me outweighed his loyalty to the Miller brand of arrogance. But as I heard him describe my father as the help who got lucky, the scales finally fell from my eyes. The Starlight Plaza Hotel features a grand ballroom with a vaulted ceiling and a lighting system that can be programmed to simulate a night sky, a feature that Caleb had insisted on because it looked expensive. As I stood there, clutching that check, I began to formulate a plan that would ensure the Millers got exactly what they deserved. I am a forensic auditor. I don't just find the rot, I document it, I categorize it, and I present it in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. I wasn't going to just cancel the wedding and walk away with a broken heart. I was going to perform a full-scale liquidation of the Miller family's reputation in front of every person they were trying to impress. I felt a cold, sharp precision take over my emotions, the same feeling I get when I'm closing in on a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme. I would take that $18,500 and I would return it to the people who actually owned it. And then I would show the 300 elite guests in the ballroom exactly what the Miller legacy was built on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At that moment, I was still the bride in the white dress, and the world still thought a union was about to take place. I walked back to my suite, passing the catering staff who were rolling in trays of Wagyu beef sliders and lobster tartlets, luxuries my parents would never dream of ordering. I saw the wedding coordinator, a woman named Julianne who charged $500 an hour to tell people where to stand, and I realized that everyone in this building was a vulture picking at the carcass of my parents' hard-earned life. I looked at the charcoal suit my father was so proud of, and the way he stood so straight despite the ache in his back, and I knew that I would rather spend the rest of my life alone than spend one more second as a member of a family that saw him as an aesthetic problem. The Millers wanted a show, and as the daughter of a man who spent 38 years cleaning up other people's messes, I was more than happy to give them one they would never forget. Family isn't a name on an investment firm or a table at a high-end gala. Family is the man who steams a 10-year-old suit with a plastic iron because he wants his daughter to be proud of him. And as I looked at that check one last time, I promised myself that by the time this night was over, the only people left standing with any dignity would be the ones the Millers thought belonged at the service entrance. The marble corridor of the Starlight Plaza Hotel felt less like a grand entrance and more like a cold, echoing gauntlet as I stood there, my fingers trembling as they clutched the heavy, hand-beaded ivory silk of my $9,000 custom gown. The dress was a masterpiece of French lace and Italian tulle, a garment designed to signal to the world that I was entering the ranks of the elite. Yet it felt like a leaden weight pulling me down into the depths of a lie I had been too blind to see until the last 60 minutes of my engagement. I forced myself to move forward, the sound of my silk-wrapped heels clicking against the polished white calicotta marble that lined the floors of the five-star venue, a sound that seemed to mock the quiet, steady rhythm of my father's work boots that had echoed through chemical plants for nearly 4 decades. I reached the entrance of the grand ballroom, where the air was thick with the scent of $500 floral arrangements consisting of rare white orchids and hydrangeas, and my eyes immediately sought out the seating chart, an ornate gold-leafed mirror etched with the names of the 300 guests who had come to witness the merger of the Miller and Sterling Vane empires. I looked at Table 1, the place of honor reserved for the family of the bride and groom, and my breath hitched in my throat when I realized my parents' names were nowhere to be found. I scanned Table 2, Table 3, and then the entire list of 30 circular tables draped in Belgian linen. But Maria and Thomas were not listed among the guests invited to sit in the main room. Panic flared in my chest, a hot, searing heat that surged through my veins until I followed the dismissive gesture of a junior event coordinator who was whispering into a headset. I walked toward the very back of the hall, past the velvet-draped pillars and the shimmering crystal chandeliers, until I reached the shadowed, drafty area directly between the heavy, swinging stainless steel kitchen doors and a jagged stack of plastic bus tubs filled with dirty glassware and discarded lemon wedges. There, shoved into a corner that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and leftover seafood, was a single 24-inch wobbly cocktail table with no chairs. Propped up on that tiny, unstable surface was a small, hand-calligraphed card that simply read, "Guest of Bride," a designation so impersonal it felt like a slap across the face. My father, Arthur, was standing there, his face a mask of stoic endurance that I had seen 1,000 times after a double shift, but today that mask was cracking. He has suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis for the last 12 years, a condition that has gnarled his joints and turned every step into a calculated negotiation with pain, and he only recently had a titanium knee replacement that still required him to sit and elevate his leg every hour to prevent the kind of agonizing swelling that makes it impossible for him to walk. Yet here he was, expected to stand for a 5-hour reception next to a stack of trash cans and the constant crashing noise of the catering staff, simply because Harrison Miller had decided that my father's presence would ruin the aesthetic of the professional photographs meant for his billionaire investors. I watched as my mother, Martha, shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands nervously smoothing the skirt of her $40 outlet store dress, a simple navy blue polyester blend she had bought with such pride, thinking it made her look like the mother of a princess. She looked humiliated, her eyes darting around the room as she realized that even the waitstaff had better accommodations than the people who had funded the very floor she was standing on. She tried to find a chair, her eyes searching the periphery of the room for a spare seat she could drag over for my father, but the coordinator had been instructed that no extra furniture was to be placed in the service corridor. Seeing her shrink into herself, trying to make her body as small as possible so as not to offend the wealthy donors walking past her with glasses of champagne, caused something inside me to snap with the clinical precision of a bone breaking in the cold. I am a senior forensic auditor, and I have spent my career watching how people try to hide the things they are ashamed of in the footnotes of their financial statements. But seeing my parents treated like a footnote in my own wedding was a level of corruption I could not allow to go unpunished. My father's hand, gnarled and scarred from 38 years of handling industrial solvents, reached out to steady the wobbly table as a waiter pushed past him with a tray of Kobe beef sliders, and I saw the way my father winced as the vibration rattled his inflamed joints. He didn't complain. He just looked at me with a watery, hopeful smile, trying to tell me with his eyes that it was okay. that he was just happy to see me in my beautiful dress, even if he had to watch from the shadows. But it wasn't okay. And as I looked at the $350 glass of Macallan in Harrison Miller's hand across the room, I realized that the $18,500 my parents had given me wasn't just money. It was their blood, their health, and their very dignity, and the Millers were currently using it as a footstool. The technical specifications of the Miller family's downfall began to assemble themselves in my mind like a perfectly balanced ledger. I remembered the internal audit I had quietly run on Harrison's primary investment vehicle, Miller Global Equities, and how I had noticed a recurring monthly payment to a consulting firm that shared an address with a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands. I realized that the reason they were so desperate to keep my parents out of sight wasn't just about class or aesthetics. It was about control. They needed the world to believe they were part of an untouchable, polished dynasty so they could finalize the fraudulent merger that would bail out their bankrupt estate. By shoving my parents into the kitchen corridor, they weren't just protecting a photograph, they were protecting a lie that was worth tens of millions of dollars in potential investment capital. I walked toward my mother, my heavy silk train gathering dust from the service entrance floor, and I didn't care that the bottom of my $9,000 dress was getting stained by the residue of the kitchen. I reached out and took her hand, which was cold and trembling, and I looked at my father, who was leaning heavily against the wall to take the weight off his titanium knee. "We're leaving," I whispered, my voice sounding like the final strike of a judge's gavel. They started to protest, my mother telling me not to ruin my big day for them, but I silenced her with a look of such absolute auditing-grade certainty that she simply nodded. I told them to go to the valet, get their car, and wait for me at the small Italian diner 3 blocks away where we used to go when I was a child. As they walked away, my father limping slightly but his head held higher now that he wasn't being forced to hide, I turned back toward the grand ballroom. I felt the weight of the encrypted phone in the hidden pocket of my gown, a device that contained enough evidence of wire fraud and tax evasion to dismantle the Miller name by sunrise. I wasn't just a bride anymore. I was a forensic auditor who had just found a massive, unforgivable discrepancy in the contract of my own life. I watched Harrison Miller laugh with a senator near the stage, his black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked out front as a symbol of a wealth that didn't actually exist, and I felt a cold, predatory calm settle over me. The Millers wanted a wedding that looked like a dream, but they were about to get an audit that felt like a nightmare. I walked toward the stage where the microphone was set up for the toasts, my mind calculating the exact interest rate on the betrayal I had just witnessed. They thought they could use the $18,500 of a janitor and a warehouse worker to buy a seat at the table of the elite, while denying those same workers a chair to sit on. They had miscalculated the one thing you can never hide from a forensic auditor, the true cost of a soul. I was going to show every person in that room that while my parents might wear $40 dresses and 10-year-old suits, they were the only ones in the building who weren't spiritually bankrupt. The aesthetic of the room was about to be ruined, not by the presence of the poor, but by the exposure of the corrupt. I reached the edge of the stage, the velvet curtains framing me as the string quartet began a soft, lyrical piece, and I realized that the most beautiful thing about the truth is that once it starts to come out, no amount of money or marble can ever shove it back behind a kitchen door. Family is who stands by you when you have nothing, and as I looked out at the sea of expectant, greedy faces, I knew that I was finally ready to settle the accounts once and for all. This wasn't the beginning of a marriage, it was the start of a total liquidation. I didn't cry as I walked away from the service entrance because my father's quiet dignity had finally transferred into my own veins, and tears would have been a waste of the clinical precision I now needed to dismantle a dynasty. I moved through the opulent corridors of the Starlight Plaza Hotel, the heavy ivory silk of my $9,000 gown whispering against the marble like a warning, and I didn't stop until I was back inside the bridal suite with the heavy mahogany door bolted firmly behind me. The room was a sanctuary of staged perfection, smelling of Jo Malone peony and blush suede candles that cost $85 apiece. But all I could see was the unsigned marriage license sitting on the antique vanity next to a crystal vase of white anemones. It was a single sheet of high-grade vellum that represented the final tether to a man who had laughed while his father insulted the man who had worked 38 years in a chemical plant to feed me. I sat down in the velvet chair, my breathing shallow and controlled, and I let my mind return to a rainy Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago when the first crack in the Miller facade had appeared under the fluorescent lights of our home office. Caleb had asked me to help him with what he called his business taxes, a task he usually handled with a team of high-priced CPAs, but he had claimed he wanted a second pair of expert eyes from a senior forensic auditor to ensure everything was airtight before the wedding. He had handed me his 2024 Alienware M18R2 laptop, a powerhouse of a machine that he used for high-end gaming and, as I soon discovered, for hiding the architectural blueprints of a financial catastrophe. While I was cross-referencing his personal deductions, my professional intuition, the same instinct that has helped me recover $40 million in embezzled funds over the last 7 years, began to itch at the back of my brain because the numbers on the surface were too perfect, too symmetrical, like a garden of plastic flowers. I ran a standard diagnostic on the hard drive and found a hidden 28-gigabyte encrypted partition that had been disguised as a system recovery file, and it took me exactly 42 minutes to bypass the secondary security layer using a decryption protocol I keep on a secure thumb drive. What I found inside that partition wasn't a set of tax returns. It was the real, unvarnished books for Miller Luxury Developments, and the reality was staggering enough to make the air leave my lungs. Harrison Miller was not the billionaire titan of industry he portrayed himself to be in the glossy pages of Forbes. He was a desperate fraud who was currently suffocating under $54 million of unsecured debt spread across 14 different offshore lenders. The Miller luxury empire was a hollowed-out shell, a grand theatrical production maintained by a series of predatory loans and interest-only payments that were eating the company alive from the inside out. The only thing keeping the banks from seizing his flagship skyscraper in downtown Cleveland, the Miller Plaza, a 60-story monument to ego and glass, was a land lease renewal that was due to expire in exactly 48 hours. In the world of high-stakes real estate, the building is only as stable as the ground it sits on, and Harrison Miller didn't own the ground. The plot of land beneath that $50 million skyscraper was owned by a private, obscure entity called the Fairgate Heritage Trust, a legacy landholding group that had been established in the late 1920s and had remained dormant and untouched for nearly a century. As I sat in the bridal suite today looking at the unsigned marriage license, the final piece of the audit clicked into place with the deafening sound of a falling guillotine. I remembered a dusty, leather-bound folder my father had kept in the top drawer of his dresser for my entire childhood. A folder he told me contained some old family business from his grandfather that he didn't quite understand because the legal language was too dense for a man who spent his nights scrubbing industrial vats. My father, Arthur, the night shift industrial janitor with grease-stained hands and a titanium knee, is the sole surviving trustee of the Fairgate Heritage Trust. The man Harrison Miller had just insulted as ruining the aesthetic of the room was the only person on the planet who held the power to sign the lease renewal that would save the Miller family from total bankruptcy. My father literally owns the very ground that Harrison's crumbling empire is built on, and for 38 years he had been cleaning the floors of a chemical plant while his family's forgotten trust sat on a piece of land worth more than every Bentley and Rolex the Millers had ever flaunted. Harrison and Caleb had been so blinded by their own class-based arrogance that they hadn't even bothered to do their due diligence on the poor family they were marrying into, assuming that because my father wore a charcoal suit from 2012 and smelled of lemon disinfectant, he was nothing more than a peasant to be tolerated until the ceremony was over. They had spent the last hour drinking $350 a glass Macallan and mocking a man who, with a single stroke of a pen, could turn their skyscraper into a pile of worthless glass and steel. The irony was so sharp, it felt like a physical edge against my throat as I stood up from the vanity and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. I could see the Miller Plaza skyscraper from here, its gold-tinted windows reflecting the setting sun, looking powerful and permanent, yet I knew it was a house of cards leaning against a hurricane. Harrison had been planning to use the $18,500 from my parents' emergency fund to pay for the luxury optics of this wedding to lure in one final investor who would provide the liquidity to pay the Fairgate lease, never realizing that the landlord he desperately needed to appease was the same man he had just banished to the service entrance. As a forensic auditor, I am trained to value integrity over appearance, and I realized that the Millers had committed the ultimate financial sin. They had underestimated the value of the person who actually held the assets. I walked over to my laptop bag, which was tucked under a pile of silk robes, and I pulled out the land lease documents I had prepared in secret over the last few weeks, just in case my suspicions were confirmed. I had the power of attorney for the Fairgate Heritage Trust. My father had signed it over to me on my 25th birthday, telling me he trusted my fancy education more than his own tired eyes. I looked at the signature line for the trustee and then at the unsigned marriage license, and I felt a surge of cold, righteous power. The Millers wanted a merger, but what they were going to get was a hostile takeover. I was going to walk into that ballroom and instead of a vow of marriage, I was going to deliver a notice of eviction that would reverberate through every bank and boardroom in the state. Harrison Miller thought he was the architect of his own destiny, but he was just a squatter on my father's land, a man who had built a life of stolen luxury on the back of the very labor he despised. The noise of the string quartet filtered through the door, the opening notes of a celebratory march that was supposed to signal my entrance, but I wasn't going to be the blushing bride they expected. I was going to be the auditor of their souls. I thought about the way my mother looked in her $40 outlet store dress and the way my father's hands shook as he tried to steady that wobbly cocktail table, and I felt a fierce, protective love that outweighed any romantic attachment I had ever felt for Caleb. Caleb had chosen his father's side. He had chosen the Macallan and the mockery, and in doing so, he had forfeited his right to the grace my family offered. I picked up a black Sharpie from the desk, a utilitarian tool that looked out of place among the gold-plated makeup brushes, and I crossed out my name on the marriage license with a single, thick, undeniable line. I wasn't just canceling a wedding. I was correcting a massive accounting error that had allowed these predators to believe they were superior to the people who actually did the work. I pulled my phone out of my clutch and sent a single text to the lead investigator at the SEC, a man I had worked with on 3 previous fraud cases, containing the password to the encrypted partition on Caleb's laptop. The rot was about to be exposed, and the liquidation of the Miller empire was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. I smoothed the ivory silk of my gown, adjusted the lace on my sleeves, and prepared to step out of the suite for the last time as Elena the bride. When I walked back into that ballroom, I wouldn't be walking toward an altar. I would be walking toward a reckoning. Harrison Miller wanted to talk about aesthetics and who belonged at the front of the room, and I was more than happy to show him exactly where he stood. The ground was shifting beneath his feet, and for the first time in 38 years, the night shift janitor was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Family is the foundation that holds you up when the world tries to tear you down, and as I gripped the handle of the door, I knew that my foundation was made of Ohio steel and industrial grease, and it was stronger than any skyscraper ever built. The audit was over, the results were in, and the Sterling Vanes were about to find out that when you insult the person who owns the land, you don't just lose the room, you lose everything. My name is Elena, and if there is one thing a career in forensic auditing teaches you, it is that every predator eventually leaves a trail of breadcrumbs made of their own arrogance and oversight. I stood in the center of the bridal suite, the heavy ivory silk of my $9,000 Vera Wang gown feeling like a suit of armor rather than a wedding dress, and I reached into the hidden pocket of my skirt to retrieve my encrypted work phone. My fingers moved with the practiced, cold efficiency of a woman who had spent 7 years dismantling corporate empires, and I dialed a number that would change the trajectory of the Miller family history forever. Marcus, my lead investigator, and the only person in the firm who knows exactly how I operate under pressure, picked up on the second ring. His voice was steady, professional, and entirely unaware that I was standing in a 5-star hotel suite decorated with $18,000 of my parents' hard-earned money. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations. I spoke with the clinical finality of a closing argument in a high-stakes courtroom. I told Marcus to immediately file the non-renewal notice for the Fairgate Heritage Trust land lease, the legal document that acted as the only support beam for the 60-story Miller Plaza skyscraper in downtown Cleveland. I told him to ensure the filing was time-stamped and mirrored to the county recorder's office before the close of business, effectively pulling the ground out from under Harrison Miller's feet before he could even finish his next glass of Macallan. But I didn't stop there, because a forensic auditor doesn't just stop a crime, she exposes the rot that allowed it to grow. I instructed Marcus to take the digital file I had meticulously compiled from Caleb's encrypted Alienware laptop, the one containing the $12 million embezzlement trail that linked Miller Luxury Developments to a series of fraudulent construction kickbacks and offshore tax shelters, and send it directly to the district attorney's white-collar crime tip line. I wanted the evidence to be sitting on a prosecutor's desk before the first dance was supposed to begin. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy as I heard Marcus confirm the instructions, the sound of his keyboard clicking in the background, a rhythmic accompaniment to the destruction of the Miller name. Once I ended the call, I walked over to the small, discreet business center located on the mezzanine level of the Starlight Plaza Hotel, a quiet alcove of mahogany desks and high-end laser printers used by executives to finalize million-dollar deals. I was still wearing the dress, the train rustling behind me like a ghost, but I didn't care about the confused looks from the hotel staff or the way the lace caught on the corner of a desk. I logged into my secure cloud server and pulled up the foreclosure notice I had drafted 48 hours ago when the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. I hit the print button and watched as 5 crisp white copies of the document emerged from the machine, the black ink still warm to the touch. These pages were the formal declaration that the Fairgate Heritage Trust was reclaiming its land and that every structure sitting upon it was now subject to immediate seizure. I folded the documents with surgical precision and tucked them into my silk clutch, right next to my lipstick and the keys to a life I was no longer interested in living. My hands did not shake as I adjusted the strap of my clutch, because I realized that the tremor I had felt earlier wasn't fear. It was the vibration of a truth finally breaking free from a mountain of lies. Caleb Sterling Vane thought he was marrying a trophy, a quiet, professional woman who would provide a prestigious, audit-proof reputation for his family's failing business, while she looked the other way during his late-night business meetings. He viewed me as a decorative asset, a senior forensic auditor whose title was more important than her actual skill, and he assumed that because I loved him, I would never dare to look at the math that defined his father's existence. He had made the fatal mistake of forgetting that my job is not just to look at the numbers, but to find the people who think they are clever enough to hide behind them. He had underestimated the daughter of a night-shift industrial janitor, forgetting that people like my father spend their lives cleaning up the messes made by people like the Millers, and that eventually, someone has to take out the trash. As I walked back toward the grand ballroom, I passed a mirrored wall and caught a glimpse of myself, a woman in a $9,000 dress carrying the financial death warrants of everyone in the room. I thought about Harrison Miller in his groom's suite, laughing about my father's charcoal suit and mocking my mother's warehouse-hardened hands, and I felt a sense of profound, icy clarity. They had treated my parents like an aesthetic problem, a stain on the perfect image they were trying to project to their billionaire investors, never realizing that the man they were hiding in the kitchen corridor was the only one in the building who actually possessed true wealth. The Millers had spent decades building a life of 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoes and private club memberships on a foundation of stolen money and borrowed land, and they truly believed that their pedigree made them untouchable. They thought that because they drank $350 whiskey, the rules of debt and integrity didn't apply to them. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that the bill always comes due, and I was here to collect. The hallway leading to the ballroom was lined with portraits of the city's founding fathers, men who had built the infrastructure I was about to dismantle, and I felt as if their eyes were following me, judging the audacity of a janitor's daughter. But I wasn't the one who had broken the law. I was the one who was enforcing it. I reached the double doors of the ballroom and could hear the muffled sound of the string quartet playing a light, airy Vivaldi concerto, the music of a world that believed everything was proceeding according to plan. I checked my watch, a modest, functional timepiece that stood in stark contrast to Caleb's Patek Philippe, and noted that it was exactly 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The guests were all in their seats, the champagne was flowing, and the Miller family was at the height of their perceived power, which made it the perfect moment to initiate the liquidation. I thought about the $18,500 sitting in my mother's purse in the form of a cashier's check, and I felt a fierce, protective heat rise in my chest. That money represented 38 years of cold storage warehouses and chemical fumes, of sacrificed vacations and missed luxuries, and the Millers had intended to use it as a decorative flourish for their own ego. They had looked at my father, Arthur, and seen a man who was beneath them, never realizing that his grease-stained hands held the deeds to their very survival. Caleb had stood by and nodded while his father suggested my parents sit near the trash tubs, and in that moment of silent complicity, he had signed his own professional and personal death warrant. He had forgotten that I am trained to catch people exactly like him, the charismatic ones, the ones who think their charm can bypass a balance sheet, the ones who believe that a forensic auditor is just another person they can manipulate. I stood at the threshold of the room, the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax swirling around me, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer the bride who had been humiliated by her in-laws. I was the senior forensic auditor who was about to perform the most significant career achievement of her life. I was going to walk into that room, bypass the altar, and hand Harrison Miller a document that would strip him of his flagship building, his reputation, and his freedom. I was going to show every elite guest in that ballroom that the poor parents they had been told to ignore were the only ones with the power to either save or destroy the Miller legacy. Family isn't a name etched in gold on a skyscraper. Family is the people who give you their last $18,000 and steam your suit with a plastic iron because they want you to have the world. The Millers were about to find out that the world doesn't belong to the people who steal it. It belongs to the people who own the ground they stand on. I gripped my clutch, felt the sharp edges of the foreclosure notices through the silk, and pushed open the doors to the ballroom. The music faltered as I walked in alone, not as a woman ready to say, "I do," but as a woman ready to say, "It's over." The audit was live, the debt was called in, and for the first time in my life, the math was going to be exactly, painfully correct. I gripped the cold titanium frame of my phone, my thumb hovering over the dial button as the sterile air of the bridal suite felt increasingly like the calm before a devastating storm. I called Marcus, my lead investigator at the firm, and when he picked up, I didn't offer a greeting. I offered an execution order. I told him to file the non-renewal notice for the Fairgate land lease immediately and to leak the $12 million embezzlement trail to the district attorney's white-collar crime division via their secure portal. I could hear the rhythmic clacking of his mechanical keyboard, a sound I usually associated with the methodical destruction of corporate tax evaders, and it felt like the heartbeat of a new reality. After hanging up, I bypassed the mirrors that reflected a bride I no longer recognized and went straight to the hotel's business center. I stood there in my $9,000 silk gown, the heavy fabric rustling against the commercial-grade carpet as I printed 5 copies of the formal foreclosure notice. The laser printer whirred, spitting out warm pages that carried the power to turn a 60-story skyscraper into a hollow monument of debt. My hands were steady, my pulse a rhythmic thrum of forensic certainty. Caleb and his father thought they had secured a trophy, a woman who would look at their balance sheets with love-blinded eyes, but they had invited a wolf into their counting house. I tucked the documents into my clutch, the sharp edges of the paper pressing against my skin like a blade, and I prepared to walk into a room filled with people who were about to witness the exact moment an empire liquidated in real time. The double doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the swell of the string quartet playing Vivaldi's Spring hit me like a physical wave of hypocrisy. I could see the layout of the room from the entrance. 300 guests, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns, with the governor sitting at table 1 next to the CEOs of the 3 largest banks in the region. They were all there to celebrate a merger of power, to toast to a legacy that was currently being disassembled by a series of digital filings 3 blocks away. Harrison Miller was at the center of it all, moving from table to table with a glass of $350 Macallan, his laughter booming over the music as he played the part of the untouchable patriarch. He looked like a man who owned the world, never suspecting that the very ground beneath his custom-made Italian shoes was shifting. I didn't wait for the wedding coordinator to signal my entrance, and I didn't take the arm of the usher who stepped forward to guide me down the aisle. Instead, I walked with a sharp, calculated stride toward the orchestra stage, my eyes locked on the wireless microphone sitting on the conductor's lectern. The music didn't just stop. It fractured as I stepped onto the platform and took the microphone. The feedback let out a sharp, metallic screech that silenced the room more effectively than a gavel. 300 heads turned in unison, a collective intake of breath that smelled of expensive catering and impending scandal. Caleb stood at the altar, his face contorting from confusion to a jagged, panicked realization as he saw the expression in my eyes. I didn't look at him for long. I looked past the crystal chandeliers and the gold-leafed pillars to the shadowed corner by the service entrance. My father was still there, leaning his weight against the wall to ease the fire in his titanium knee, his charcoal suit from 2012 looking like a badge of honor compared to the borrowed finery of the men in the front row. "My name is Elena," I said, my voice projected through the $20,000 Bose system with a coldness that froze the champagne in every glass. "And before we proceed with the vows, we need to discuss the outstanding debts of the Miller family." I saw Harrison Miller's face drain of color, turning the sickly shade of old parchment as I pulled the first copy of the foreclosure notice from my clutch. I spoke with the clinical precision of a final audit, detailing the $12 million hole in their construction accounts and the $54 million in unsecured debt that was currently suffocating Miller luxury developments. The bank CEOs at Table 1 leaned in, their professional masks slipping to reveal the predatory instinct of lenders who smell a default. I explained, for everyone to hear, that the Miller Plaza skyscraper sat on land owned by the Fairgate Heritage Trust, and that the janitor Harrison had tried to hide by the trash tubs was the sole surviving trustee who had just authorized the seizure of the property. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where the Miller legacy used to be. I watched as Caleb's hands began to shake, his Patek Philippe watch catching the light as his world dissolved into a series of criminal charges and bankruptcy filings. I wasn't just canceling a wedding, I was performing a public autopsy on a fraud. When I finished, I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I stepped down from the stage, the ivory silk of my dress no longer a symbol of union, but a flag of conquest. I walked through the parted crowd, the elite of the city recoiling as if my honesty were a contagion. I reached the back of the room, took my father's hand, and felt the rough, grease-stained skin of a man who had actually earned his place in the world. We walked out of the Starlight Plaza together, leaving the governor and the billionaires to pick through the wreckage of the Millers' shattered aesthetic. As we stepped into the cool evening air, the skyscraper in the distance looked smaller, a mere stack of glass and steel that no longer had a foundation to stand on. Family isn't the prestige of a name or the depth of a bank account. It's the strength of the ground you refuse to let them steal. The audit was closed, the accounts were settled, and as I helped my father into the car, I knew that for the first time in 38 years, the numbers finally told the truth. The silence that followed my pronouncement was not merely a lack of noise, but a heavy, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the Starlight Plaza's grand ballroom as I stood on that stage, the wireless microphone feeling like a cold, iron weight in my palm. I looked out over the sea of 300 faces, witnessing the exact moment that the carefully curated masks of the city's elite began to crumble under the weight of a mathematical truth they could no longer ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and my voice did not waver as it was captured by the $40,000 state-of-the-art L-acoustic sound system, the digital processors stripping away any hint of a tremor and projecting my words with a clinical, terrifying clarity that reached every corner of the room, from the gold-leafed moldings of the ceiling to the shadowed service corridor where my father still stood. The man hosting this event, Harrison Miller, believes my father is too poor to sit in this room, and he has spent the last hour making it clear to anyone who would listen that a man who worked 40 years in a grueling chemical factory is nothing more than a stain on his carefully constructed aesthetic. I turned my head slightly to look directly at Harrison, whose face had transitioned from a pale gray to a sickly, mottled purple, his hand frozen midair as he gripped a crystal tumbler of Macallan that suddenly looked like a prop from a play that had just been canceled. So, I've decided to help Harrison with his optics by providing him with a view of the world that is unburdened by the illusions of wealth he has spent a lifetime fabricating. Because as a senior forensic auditor, I find that the most beautiful aesthetic of all is a balanced ledger that reflects the honest truth. "Harrison," I continued, the sound of my own breathing amplified into a rhythmic, predatory thrum through the speakers, "your flagship tower, the 60-story monument to your ego that dominates the downtown skyline, sits on a specific plot of land owned entirely by the Fairgate Heritage Trust, a private entity that you have spent years trying to manipulate and circumvent. What you failed to realize while you were mocking the man in the charcoal suit is that my father, Arthur, is the sole surviving trustee of that land, and less than 10 minutes ago, I personally authorized the formal non-renewal of your land lease." The collective gasp that rippled through the room was a physical thing, a wave of shock that made the heavy velvet curtains vibrate as the realization set in for every developer and banker in attendance that the Miller Empire was no longer standing on solid ground. "You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and remove your name from the glass," I added, the words falling like heavy, leaden strikes of a clock signaling the end of an era, because the Fairgate Heritage Trust no longer finds the Miller family to be a solvent or honorable tenant. I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out the 5 crisp white copies of the foreclosure notice I had printed in the business center, holding them up high so that the high-definition cameras meant to record a joyous union instead broadcasted the legal instruments of a total corporate liquidation. The panic in the room was almost palpable now, a sharp metallic scent that cut through the fragrance of the $10,000 floral arrangements. But I wasn't finished with the audit because a true forensic investigation requires the full exposure of the rot. And for the investors in the room, the men and women who have entrusted Miller Luxury Developments with your capital and your reputations, I suggest you check your mobile devices and your encrypted emails immediately, I said, my voice dropping an octave into a register of absolute, professional finality. You will find a comprehensive digital folder containing the audited records of the $12 million that Caleb and Harrison Miller quietly borrowed from your private pension funds and employee retirement accounts over the last 18 months just to maintain the liquidity required to pay for this very champagne you are currently drinking. The room didn't just gasp this time. It erupted into a frantic, low-frequency hum of movement as some of the most powerful people in the state reached for their phones with trembling fingers, their faces illuminated by the ghostly blue light of screens that were delivering the news of their own betrayal. I saw a prominent senator, a man who had been laughing with Harrison only minutes ago, lose his grip on his heavy crystal glass, and the sound of it shattering against the polished marble floor was a sharp, jagged punctuation mark that echoed through the ballroom. It was a perfect crystalline metaphor for the Miller family's reputation, which was currently being ground into fine, irreparable dust under the boots of the people they had stolen from. I watched Caleb as he stood by the altar, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume that was 2 sizes too big for him, his eyes darting toward the exit as if he could somehow run away from the math. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the man I thought I loved, but that image was instantly replaced by the memory of him nodding in agreement when his father suggested my parents sit near the trash tubs. He had forgotten that I am a woman who is paid to find the hidden, the ugly, and the fraudulent, and he had made the fatal mistake of assuming that my heart was less disciplined than my mind. You thought you were marrying a trophy who would add a layer of professional legitimacy to your crimes, I thought, but you were actually inviting the auditor into the vault while the lights were still on. I looked back at my father, whose tired eyes were now bright with a mixture of disbelief and a fierce, quiet pride that made every year of his labor feel vindicated in an instant. He wasn't the stain on the room, he was the owner of the room. And as the realization spread through the crowd, I saw the bank CEOs at Table 1 begin to stand up, their expressions shifting from guests to creditors in the blink of an eye. The string quartet had long since retreated into the wings, their instruments silent, leaving only the sound of my voice and the mounting chaos of 300 people realizing they were standing in the middle of a crime scene. Harrison tried to move toward the stage, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a lie large enough to cover a $54 million hole, but he was intercepted by 2 of his primary investors whose faces were masks of cold, litigious fury. The optics were finally clear. The Millers were not the architects of the city's future, but the squatters of its past, living on borrowed time and stolen dignity until a daughter of the night shift came to collect the debt. I felt a profound, icy calm settle over me as I stepped down from the orchestra platform, the ivory silk of my dress rustling like the turning of a final page in a very long, very fraudulent book. I didn't need a bouquet or a ring to feel complete. I had the truth, and in the world of forensic auditing, the truth is the only currency that never devalues. I walked toward the back of the room, my head held high as the governor stepped aside to let me pass, his gaze fixed on the floor in a gesture of sudden, belated respect. I reached the small, wobbly cocktail table where my parents were standing, and I saw that my mother was crying, not out of shame, but because for the first time in 40 years, she didn't have to feel small in a room full of giants. I took the microphone one last time, even as I walked away from the stage, my voice still carrying through the massive sound system. This wedding is not a union. It is a liquidation. And the Miller family is officially bankrupt in every way that matters, I announced, the words lingering in the air like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. We walked toward the main exit, bypassing the service entrance that Harrison had insisted we use, and as the heavy mahogany doors closed behind us, I heard the roar of the crowd turning into the sound of a reckoning. My name is Elena, and I am 29 years old, and today I learned that the most expensive things in life, integrity, loyalty, and the love of a father who steams his own suit, can never be bought with embezzled funds. We stepped out into the night, the cool air of the city tasting like freedom, and as we walked away from the Starlight Plaza, I knew that the ground beneath my feet was finally, undeniably, our own. The Miller Plaza might still be standing for another 30 days, but the empire it represented had already collapsed into the dust of its own arrogance, leaving nothing behind but the shattered glass of a reputation that was never as solid as it appeared. I led my parents toward the waiting car, my hand firmly on my father's arm, knowing that the only aesthetic that truly matters is the one you can look at in the mirror without flinching. The audit was finished, The accounts were settled, and for the first time in my life, the balance sheet of my soul was in perfect, beautiful harmony. I stepped down from the orchestra platform for the final time, the heavy ivory silk of my $9,000 gown no longer feeling like a garment of celebration, but like a discarded shell of a life that had been built on a foundation of sophisticated lies and calculated cruelty. I did not look back at the altar where Caleb stood paralyzed, and I did not glance at Harrison Miller as he was swarmed by the very men whose retirement funds he had treated like a personal piggy bank. Instead, I focused entirely on the small, shadowed corner near the kitchen doors. I reached my father, Arthur, and took his arm, feeling the coarse fabric of his 2012 charcoal suit beneath my fingers, a suit he had steamed with such hope and such misplaced humility, and I felt a surge of protective ferocity that outweighed every ounce of grief I should have felt for my canceled wedding. We walked out of that ballroom together, my mother, Martha, clutching her $40 outlet store purse with a newfound strength in her shoulders, and as we passed through the grand foyer of the Starlight Plaza Hotel, the staff who had earlier ignored us now stood in a line of stunned, respectful silence. We bypassed the valet where the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country was parked, a vehicle that would likely be repossessed by the end of the month, and I hailed a simple yellow taxi, the most honest form of transportation in a city suddenly choked by the exhaust of failing legacies. We drove away from the glittering glass facade of the hotel and ended up at a local 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, a place called Benny's, where the air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup instead of expensive lilies and fraudulent ambition. I sat my father down in a vinyl booth, making sure he had enough room to stretch out his titanium knee and rest his arthritic hands on the Formica tabletop, and I ordered him the biggest, most expensive ribeye steak on the menu with a side of loaded mashed potatoes. It was the first time all day I had seen his face truly relax, the lines of chronic pain and social humiliation softening under the warm, fluorescent hum of a place where a man's worth is measured by his character rather than his zip code. My mother sat across from him, her eyes bright with a quiet, shimmering pride as she watched me pull a thick stack of napkins from the dispenser to wipe a smudge of kitchen grease off the hem of my designer dress. We sat in that booth for nearly 2 hours, talking about the Fairgate Heritage Trust and the childhood stories my father had nearly forgotten, while the $19,000 wedding cake back at the hotel was likely being carved up by federal agents and disgruntled creditors. By the time we had finished our dessert, a simple slice of apple pie that tasted more like victory than any tiered confection ever could, the small television mounted above the diner counter was already flashing breaking news alerts regarding the Starlight Plaza scandal. The local news anchor was reporting on the sudden cancellation of the Miller-Vane wedding and the simultaneous filing of multi-million-dollar fraud charges against Miller Luxury Developments, the screen showing grainy footage of Harrison Miller being escorted out of the hotel by 2 men in dark suits. My phone, which I had placed face down on the table, began to vibrate with a frantic, rhythmic intensity that didn't stop for 20 minutes, a digital death rattle of a relationship that had never truly existed. I finally turned it over to see 42 frantic, increasingly desperate text messages from Caleb, ranging from pathetic pleas for forgiveness to vitriolic accusations of betrayal, each one a testament to the fact that he was more concerned with the loss of his lifestyle than the loss of the woman he claimed to love. I didn't reply to a single one. Instead, I opened my contacts, selected his name, and hit the block button with a sense of surgical finality that felt like the most satisfying audit I had ever performed. I settled the bill at the diner using the $18,500 that I had reclaimed for my parents, ensuring that every cent they had sacrificed would go back into an account they could use for their own retirement and medical care. I called a locksmith on the way back to the apartment Caleb and I had shared, a sprawling, minimalist loft in the Pearl District that cost $8,000 a month in rent that was likely paid with stolen pension funds. And I sat in the hallway for an hour while the cylinders were changed and the digital codes were wiped clean. I moved his designer luggage and his collection of vintage watches into the hallway, leaving them next to the service elevator he had so casually suggested my parents should use. And I walked into my own home for the first time in years, feeling completely, undeniably free. The silence of the apartment was a luxury that no amount of Miller money could ever buy, a silence unburdened by the weight of fake gold and the constant underlying hum of a lie that was waiting to be exposed. I spent the rest of the night in a pair of old cotton pajamas, sitting on my balcony and watching the city lights, the distant silhouette of the Miller Plaza skyscraper looking like a ghost in the darkness, a monument that would soon belong to the Fairgate Heritage Trust and the man who had spent 38 years cleaning floors. I realized then that I had spent my entire career searching for the rot in corporate ledgers, but the most dangerous discrepancy had been in my own heart. The belief that I had to trade my family's dignity for a seat at a table that was built on theft. I had performed a total liquidation of a dynasty in 60 minutes, and in doing so, I had finally balanced the accounts of my own life, proving that a senior forensic auditor is never more powerful than when she is protecting the people who actually do the work. The Millers were facing federal fraud charges, total bankruptcy, and a lifetime of public disgrace. But as I looked at the charcoal suit my father had left folded neatly on the chair, I knew that we were the only ones who had walked away with our assets intact. Integrity is a foundation that cannot be foreclosed upon, and as the sun began to rise over a city that would never look at the Miller name the same way again, I felt a deep, abiding peace in the knowledge that I was finally standing on solid ground. Family isn't the prestige of a name or the glitter of a wedding. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out and the people who own the land because they were humble enough to walk on it without greed. I had cut the toxic rot out of my life to save my dignity. And as the first light of dawn hit the glass of the skyline, I knew that the audit was finally, perfectly complete.